So this week's reading was all about digestion, and you learned about all the different parts and the processes that are happening along the way. How long does it take from something to go in one end and out the other? So the total journey takes anywhere between 14 and 70 hours. And I looked up last night to see how much research has been done and how long these different things actually take. So food does not stay very long in your stomach. It's there for a couple of hours. It doesn't stay terribly long in the small intestine. It's there for 2 to 6 hours. And most of the journey of your food is on the way out. So in the large intestine, that process moves a lot more slowly. And that's where water is drawn out. And so that process can take anywhere from 10 hours to a few days. So my question for you is, what's happening in these three organs? So in the stomach, you're having both mechanical, which is the grinding, the churning of the stomach. So mechanical breakdown, where you're physically breaking down some large pieces of food. And then chemical breakdown, which is the stomach acid, right? And by other enzymes that are being released. So in the stomach, we have chemical breakdown of proteins, especially. So protein digestion happens primarily in the stomach. And other things get digested a little bit, but then their enzymatic chemical breakdown happens in the small intestine. So what else happens in the small intestine? After we get out of the stomach, what happens to that bolus, which is what we call it after it started to break down? What happens to the bolus when it's in the small intestine? The small intestine absorbs nutrients. So the small intestine has two big jobs, and it's sort of divided physically. So the first third of the small intestine does a different job. And the second 2/3 of the small intestine is primarily for absorbing nutrients. So what happens in that very first part? So if we look here, we've got the end of the stomach, and the stomach right here is moving into the small intestine. And right here, tucked in the intersection, is the pancreas. So the pancreas is going to dump something into the top of the small intestine. What is it releasing? What does it do? The pancreas releases all kinds of enzymes. So the pancreas does other stuff too. But first, we'll talk about enzymes. Many of the digestive enzymes that are responsible for breaking down our foods, like our carbohydrates and our lipids, are produced by the pancreas. So you have amylase. You read a little bit about how digestion also starts to happen in the mouth. So you have a little bit of enzyme that is released in the mouth. And that's why if you've ever eaten a piece of bread and it started to taste sweet, because you're starting to break down that starch into sugar. And we'll look at that more next week when we look at the different molecules. So there's a little bit of enzyme breakdown in the mouth, but then those enzymes get killed off by the stomach acid. And so the pancreas releases a whole bunch of new enzymes right after the food comes out of the stomach acid to break everything down. So this is where there'll be continued breakdown of proteins, but also major breakdown of lipids and of carbohydrates of all kinds. So if you were to zoom in right here, there's a little duct that feeds from the small intestine and the liver as well into the very top of the small intestine. So in addition to food coming in from the stomach, there are also like enzymes being squirted in right as the food is coming in. Mm-hmm. So that's really what's happening in the first third of the small intestine. And that completes most of the breakdown. So food at that point is in its individual pieces. So instead of big proteins, you now have amino acids, and we'll learn about those next week. And those are the level of nutrients that are then being absorbed in the small intestine. The other thing that the pancreas does is releases hormones that regulate all kinds of things related to food. So they regulate blood sugar by releasing insulin and glucagon, which are the two dueling hormones that try to maintain your blood sugar at just the right level. And they release all kinds of other hormones too that do things like tell your brain that you're not hungry anymore and you can stop eating. So the last part of this track is the large intestine. This is where the most time is spent. What's happening in there? What's the primary role of the large intestine? When digestion happens, it has to happen in water. And next week, you'll learn about the reaction that actually takes place and why it has to happen in water. So we'll come back to that. But it has to be in water. And so as your food is brought into your mouth, you're adding water and saliva. In the stomach and in the small intestine, you're adding liquid along with those enzymes. And then all of that water wants to be reabsorbed. You don't want to waste all of that water, right? So the large intestine's primary job is to reabsorb water. The longer food stays in the large intestine, the more water is reabsorbed. So that means that if you don't have good motility of the large intestine, if your bowels aren't moving the right amount, then things might sit around in the large intestine longer than they needed to. And that's what can lead to constipation because that fecal matter becomes so dry and hard. On the opposite end, if your large intestine is irritated and like really contracting a lot, and that can happen with some things like IBS or Crohn's disease, you can have the material move through the large intestine much more quickly than it should, not as much time to reabsorb water, and then you've got loose stools instead. So the timing of the large intestine has a lot to do with the product that comes out and how comfortable it is for you. Just switching gears, and we're going to talk about probiotics versus prebiotics. This came up a few times in the reading, and folks were curious about what the difference is and what their roles are, and about how much impact they can really have. So first, I wanted to define what the difference is. So probiotic contains live microbes. So these are food. The most common thing that people eat that's probiotic is yogurt. So yogurt always contains live microbes, lactobacillus, if you've ever seen that written on the side of your cup, lactobacillus acidophilus. And that's what this looks like. That's actually what this is. They can contain other kinds of microbes too, but they contain living microbes. And those microbes were part of the food making process. So when they made yogurt, and we'll learn about this when we learn about fermentation, when yogurt is made, those microbes are digesting some of the sugars that were present in that product before it became yogurt. And they're acidifying it and turning into this delicious yogurt that we eat. Other foods that are fermented like sauerkraut or soy or a million other things. Oh, kefir came up. Anything like that, those are probiotic foods. And those microbes are there because they had a role in breaking down those foods in the way that they are now delicious to us. And they're still alive. And so when we eat them, those microbes can take up residence in our gut. A prebiotic does not contain living microbes. It contains nutrients that when they arrive in the gut will support those microbes. So we always have microbes in our gut, and the kinds of foods that we eat have a really strong impact on the kinds of microbes that successfully live there. So if we eat lots of foods like this, these foods all contain complex carbohydrates that are specific to certain populations of microbes that are beneficial microbes that live in our gut. So if we give them all of these good kinds of carbohydrates in these forms from foods, they're going to be happy. Those good microbes are going to bloom. Their populations are going to be strong, and they're going to outcompete other microbes that might be harmful. So you can take prebiotics as a supplement. You can take probiotics as a supplement, but you can also just eat food. So if you want to eat probiotics, then you want to eat fermented things, yogurts. If you want to eat prebiotics, then you want to eat whole foods and lots of fruits and veggies. So somebody asked, are fruits and vegetables an example of a functional food? Absolutely. So anything that's considered a prebiotic and any fruit and vegetable would be considered a functional food because they're providing all of this additional function because they contain vitamins and nutrients that are going to support the body in different ways besides just providing energy to the body. Another question that somebody asked related to this was, can prebiotics and functional foods alleviate gut issues? So I thought we would talk a little bit about the role of the microbiome in health overall and the ways that the microbiome can affect your gut health. Okay, so what is the purpose of this gut microbiome, or what is it doing? So the gut microbiome is immensely powerful, and it's only been in the last 20 years that we've really started to accumulate information about what it's doing and how complex it is. What we've learned is that it's immeasurably complex and that it's changing all of the time. It's very dynamic, this population that's living inside of you. So it's its own living ecosystem that's happening in your gut. And the things that you consume and the activities that you do are changing the environmental factors for this population of microbes that's living in your gut. So some of the things that affect the population are genetics. So your genetics will determine some things about the nature of your gut that will be supportive or not supportive for certain species of bacteria. Stress causes releases of certain hormones. That hormones might impact the bacteria that are living in your gut. Your diet is probably the largest impact. So the things that you eat directly impact the things that live in your gut. And there have been some really interesting studies. There was one just a couple of years ago where this very dedicated scientist tracked every single thing he ate and took a fecal sample every single day for an entire year. And he measured what the different microbes were, and he tried to associate, well, when I ate this, how were the microbes? He at one point took a trip. So he lived, I think, in California, and he took a trip to Asia for a few weeks and then came back. And so he got to see that even though his personal diet was very similar over that time, just being in another part of the world changed his microbiome. And when he came back, it shifted back to how it had been before. So that says that there are environmental factors that we don't fully understand that are impacting our microbiome. But a lot of that is food. And so the food that you're getting is directly impacting the things that are living there. If you've ever had antibiotics and then had a very bad digestive week, it's because those antibiotics also wipe out your gut, right? That's the whole point of antibiotics, is they're supposed to kill microbes. So they kill microbes and they will kill the things that are living in your gut. One of the things that happens is that folks after antibiotics will often have a flare-up of yeast. So yeast are not bacteria. Yeast are actually eukaryotes. So they're cells like ours. And so antibiotics don't kill them the same way that they kill bacteria. So if you kill all your bacteria in the gut, then those yeast that survived, they're like, oh, sweet, there's nobody here to compete with, and they expand. So then you can have really uncomfortable consequences of that. And so some folks are more sensitive to this than others, but after antibiotics, a lot of folks have GI distress. The other thing that will happen is that you can have yeast blooms all over your body. So you can have something called thrush, which is where yeast grow in your mouth. You can have vaginal yeast infections. You can have skin yeast infections because you've wiped out microbiomes all over your body that are at this particular balance. The last one on this list that's factors that affect gut microbiome are what happens to you early in childhood. So there have been really interesting studies that show that even from the second of birth, the way that babies are delivered impacts their microbiome, because a baby delivered by cesarean section has a different first experience with the world than a baby that is delivered vaginally. And delivering vaginally means that that baby is going to pick up some microbiomes from the skin on the way out that are going to start to colonize. And when a baby is delivered by C-section, they don't. The other really important early childhood thing is about what kinds of microbes they interact with, whether and what they're fed. So formula fed versus breastfed, when they start eating foods, how much they're crawling around on the ground, how much they're picking up things and putting in their mouth. All of that stuff impacts that colonization that happens early in a human, and that can have lifelong impacts on the way that their microbiome is set up. All of that is super cool. So then what happens? Like what's the impact of all this changes in your microbiome? There are changes to the gut, and those are the ones that we think about the most. So we talked a bit about intestinal motility. So those microbes are releasing molecules that are impacting your cells. So they're impacting the muscle cells. That's what this is trying to show you in the gut. And they can be impeding or encouraging those muscles to contract. And that can mean that food is moving through the gut faster or slower, causing constipation or diarrhea. It can affect sensation. So it can actually affect the nerves and the way that you're feeling experiences like bloating or gas. And so some people will be more sensitive to feeling gas and bloating than others and will have more discomfort from that. Intestinal barrier function just means that like the integrity of the cells and the way that they're packed together and the way that they are sort of filtering what stays in the gut and what gets to come into the rest of the body can also be impacted. And so that can cause a whole range of different problems. There's a huge immune function of the gut. So most people don't think of the gut as being an important site for your immune system, but it absolutely is. So your gut is sort of like the outside world, right? You're taking things from the outside world and you're putting them inside of your body. And so the gut is this place where the immune system is very active to try to figure out what it is that you're seeing. Do we need to react to any of this? Do we need to kill stuff? Is this okay? And that is, we'll talk about food allergies in a minute and how that plays into this. And then the last thing is about the gut-brain axis. So there's communication along nerves between all parts of our body, but there's a really strong communication between a nerve in the gut and the brain that can actually have all kinds of impacts on mental health. So there have been lots of really interesting studies in the last few years where they've looked at people's microbiome balances and then propensities for anxiety and depression. And there's some relationship there that is not yet well understood. All right, the last little section of info that I brought you is about allergy and intolerance, because the other things, the questions and comments that came up a lot were about food allergies, about peanut allergies and milk allergies, and then about celiac and the ideas of lactose intolerance or gluten intolerance, and what is the difference between all of this. So I brought first just a table to show you the difference between allergy and intolerance. And this example I used was the milk allergy, because someone asked, is milk allergy the same thing as lactose intolerance? Are they related? No, they're not. So a milk allergy, any allergy, is a reaction to proteins. So a reaction to milk proteins is the cause of milk allergy. And it's your immune cells seeing that milk protein and expanding and causing all this commotion. Lactose intolerance, or any kind of intolerance, is a lack of your body's ability to break something down. So if you lack the enzyme that breaks down lactase, and you'll read about this next week because that's the milk sugar, then your body can't break down lactase. And so you get all this molecule in your body that you can't break down. So that is the ultimate cause, and that's fundamentally different between them. In this case, there are some overlapping symptoms, and there often are between food allergies and food intolerance because a lot of the symptoms happen in the gut. So one of the main differences is that allergies happen systemically. So the first things that happen in a milk allergy are all things that happen in your face or in the top part of your body because you've put milk into your face. And so you'll get rashes, hives, your mouth will swell up, your face will start itching. As this sort of reaction starts to spread out of the body, it can move into your respiratory system. You can have trouble breathing. All of that is classical allergy reaction, and it happens regardless of what kind of thing you're allergic to. All of these things are possibilities. As that reaction moves through the body because you swallowed this milk, as the milk then moves into the gut, then you've got allergy things happening inside of the gut, and they can cause all of these kinds of symptoms. So then you can have diarrhea, nausea, bloating, and cramps, and gas, and all of that. These things are also the same symptoms of most intolerances. And so this is, I think, why it gets muddy and why folks will be like, well, I have these symptoms, so what is it? Do I have an allergy or an intolerance? And the fundamental difference is all of this kind of stuff. These two things also are kind of interesting because they change over time. So someone was really surprised that milk allergy was the most common allergy in children, which it is. So it's really common in early childhood, but it tends to decline with age. So it's something like 80% of kids who have a dairy allergy in their first year of life won't have a dairy allergy by the time that they're a teenager. So a lot of kids lose that allergy. On the flip side, lactose intolerance goes the other way. So evolutionarily, we have lactose enzyme as in early childhood, as lots and lots of mammals do, because that's when our diet is heavily milk-based. So we've got lots of lactase being produced so that we can break down all the lactose as we're breastfeeding and consuming lots of milk. But about at age 5, that enzyme starts to decline. So some populations, the enzyme doesn't decline that much. And so this is why a lot of folks can continue to have milk throughout adulthood. But a lot of other folks will have a sharp decline throughout their childhood. And so by the time they're an adult, they really can't tolerate lactose anymore. And then the treatments, well, you can always just avoid all of these things. And so for milk allergy, that's what you do. So you just don't have any milk products because there's nothing you can remove from the milk or add to the milk that takes away the fact that those proteins are there. But for lactose intolerance, you can selectively remove that one thing that your body can't break down. So there are lactose-free products, or you can give the enzyme back. So you can take lactase enzyme while you're eating that ice cream, and then it'll help your body break that down. So milk is in fact the most common allergen for children, and it's followed by eggs and peanut allergies. For adults, this is not true because most kids lose their milk allergy over time. So for adults, shellfish is the most common allergen, followed by peanuts and tree nuts. So someone also asked, well, like in school, peanut allergies were a huge thing, right? No peanuts everywhere. Why is it not like that for milk? So part of the reason is because of all of the different kinds of food allergies, peanut and tree nut allergies are the most severe. So they cause the lion's share of fatal reactions. And so that's why we're so vigilant about them, because they can cause anaphylactic reactions, which are like the rash, hives, wheezing, can't breathe, except systemically to the point of death. So those cause the most severe reactions, and that's why we pay the most attention to them, whereas milk allergy is not usually that severe. Somebody wanted to know, why are allergies on the rise? So I didn't restrict this to food allergies because the truth is that it's not just food allergies that are on the rise. Food allergies are absolutely on the rise. And there is a study that just came out last year that said for peanut and nut allergies, they've gone up 21% in the last 15 years, which is shockingly high. The thing that we often say when all of a sudden the rate of something in human health skyrockets, the first question we ask ourselves is it just that we figured out how to analyze this and now we know that people have it? And no, that's not it. So this is a genuine increase in folks who have allergies because it's pretty easy to know when someone has an allergy. there's sort of three broad categories of things that we think are going on, but a lot of this is still a hypothesis that is being tested continuously. So we know that there are environmental factors. Allergies are higher in urban areas, and as urbanization has increased, we've seen the rates of allergies increase as well. There's also a role for climate change. So climate change causes shifts in especially outdoor allergens. So pollens have bloomed, and there have been certain kinds of plants that have increased in their pollen production because of climate change. Also super interesting, totally unrelated to nutrition, but I have to tell you because it's so interesting. Read this article yesterday. Did you know that urban planning in the 1960s is currently hurting those of us with tree allergies? Because female trees don't release pollen, but they make a hot mess because they drop flowers and berries and whatever else. So like 50 years ago, somebody figured this out and said, oh, no, let's only plant male trees because they don't make a mess on our sidewalks. Oh, that sounds like a great idea. Male trees release pollen. And if there aren't female trees around, female trees have an electrostatic ability to pull pollen out of the air and towards them so that they can be fertilized. But we haven't been planting any female trees. So we've been planting all these male trees, just throwing pollen in the air with nothing to catch it for decades. And that is also a very important reason why pollen allergies are on the rise. And people should be talking about this. Why aren't we planting female trees? That's another day. The second category, that is probably the largest category because it contains so many things, is that we are doing things to reduce our immune function. And some of those are lifestyle, and some of those are genetic, and some of those go back to our microbiome. And this is also a really big one. So vitamin D levels are directly related to all kinds of different allergies and autoimmune disorders. So low vitamin D is associated with various immunological problems. And vitamin D comes from sun exposure. So as we have gotten less sun exposure over time because our lives are increasingly indoors, or we're increasingly sunscreening ourselves and taking care not to get too much sun, which is also very important, our vitamin D levels are lowered. So that has a global impact on the overall immune levels of folks. Our microbiome factors also play a role. So like we just said, there's immune activation that's happening in the gut, and the microbes that are there are playing a direct role in how strong that immune reaction is. So going back to this idea of early childhood experience, that's another thing on this list that connects back to this idea of microbiome factors. So what that child may have eaten can impact its microbiome. What you're currently eating impacts your microbiome, and all of that can impact your immune health. Genetics are definitely a factor because there are genetic tendencies to have allergies. And so it could also be that those traits might have been selected against in the past because folks that had really strong reactions to allergies would die. And now we have treatments to help people survive really strong anaphylactic reactions, right? Folks walk around with EpiPens. But that also means that folks that have these genetic predispositions to really strong allergies are surviving to have children who have genetic predispositions to really strong allergies. And so there is a genetic component in that we are now better able to help people survive with this genetic difference. And so that's going to be allowed to expand. And diet is the last part because diet impacts vitamin D. It impacts your microbiome as well. The very last one is one that you might have heard about, and it's often called the hygiene hypothesis. So the hygiene hypothesis means that we are not exposed to as many microbes or allergens that we used to be, especially really early in childhood when your immune system is being formed. So the immune system is basically naive when the babies are born. And those first few years are extremely important for building up the immune system, teaching the immune system what is safe and what is okay, what we do not need to freak out about, and what are real threats, right? And so there's all kinds of complex factors that happen in the immune system to work all of that out. If you don't see certain microbes or allergens for the first few years of your life, then your body hasn't figured out that those are okay. And so if you introduce them a little bit later, you can have these dramatic overreactions because to the body, well, we've established our immune system. We figured out what was okay and what was not. And this thing is new. And so the idea that we're not exposed to as much stuff early in childhood because our lives are cleaner, because we're more careful to wash hands and clean everything for our children, because there was some bad advice that happened a few decades ago about when to introduce certain kinds of allergenic foods to children, such as peanuts and eggs, that's now been walked back. And so there was some period of delay where folks just didn't see that. So probably all of these things are true. And it will be a lot of work to tease apart what is the biggest impact. And that's what's ongoing right now.